Could the Earth actually be flat? I began to see opinions and arguments that seemed logical, but I heard several arguments, which I now know were most likely disinformation, easily disprovable in the aviation world, but there were some that stuck with me. And so, myself being the way I am, I ran quickly, metaphorically, to my old textbook, and I opened my old textbooks, found them, unpacked them, cracked them all open, and even downloaded brand new copies in PDF form offline of all these books to make sure that nothing had been changed. I thought for certain that I knew exactly what compensation pilots are trained while flying to compensate for the spin or the rotation of the Earth, for instance. As far as falling around a globe, that I assumed in my mind would be an aircraft's angle of attack. But upon more study, I found that not to be true. The angle of attack being the angle between the aircraft's flight path and the relative wind, which is something that pilots are very familiar with. And it's the idea that an aircraft has to be slightly pitched up, essentially to stay airborne, or a surface of that aircraft has to be pitched slightly to create a difference in air pressure to hold the aircraft aloft. And that is assumed, or was assumed at that time by myself and other pilots, to be the compensation one would make for falling around a globe while flying, period. But upon further research, I found that this was not the case, and it was not even mentioned anywhere. This compensation was not mentioned anywhere I could find in any resource that I had gone to flight school with. And they were extensive. There were many, many books, especially as one progressed towards the commercial flying side, especially elective courses, especially if you're going to university as I was studying aerospace, then you would assume, and I had assumed, that this was calculated for.
Again, as far as ADIs, in every aircraft, it references the level horizon or references sea level always. There's no way that you can convince somebody of sound mind that if you take off from New York and immediately flip upside down, now your housing or your ADI is referencing upside down to you because you're upside down. It's right side up. It cannot deviate off level. It doesn't matter how much fuel you got in your tanks. It doesn't matter if you're a helicopter or an aerostat or a fighter jet. That gauge will always reference level. It has to, because otherwise it would be a poor reference. And if you could manipulate it, why would you even have it in the airplane or your aircraft? But if you go take off 2 miles away, do a barrel roll, you're now flying upside down. At what point does that gauge show you back right side up? A half a hemisphere away? Is that what we're led to believe? Is that what we're supposed to believe? At what point does it right itself if you never flipped back over and continue flying level? You see what I'm saying? It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous to think that thing compensates for curvature in straight and level flight.
The big one that is oftentimes quoted is compensation for Coriolis effect while flying. And this is something I'd even taught my students about, and it's always assumed to be correct. We just assume. We're given the narrative from a young age, and everything is built upon that assumption, upon that theory. And so I thought I had the silver bullet. Coriolis effect. We always calculate for that. Well, as I began to look through the books and to look into the calculations given for Coriolis effect, the narrative began to fall apart even further. I began to see things I didn't notice when I was in school, such as Coriolis effect is actually never calculated for, but is assumed to be a part of wind correction angle. Wind correction angle is one of the many calculations pilots of all kinds make while flying to correct against winds in whatever volume or section of air they're flying through, which it could be from any direction, and you're flying through it, so you have to compensate a certain angle into that wind to hold a straight line.
Interesting side note, I worked on aerostats for several years, and I always ask people who try to bring up gravity, well, how come my 4,000 pound, 74,000 cubic foot aerostat isn't getting pushed towards the ground? It weighs more than you do, which you believe gravity is pushing you down, right? Because these are some dense ass people. But how come the aerostat's not getting driven into the ground? It weighs more, It's definitely larger than the size of a house. It's more than size of most houses. So why isn't it getting driven to the ground? Well, that's because it's displacing less weight than the atmosphere or the medium that it's in. And I try explaining that. I don't know how many times you've probably posted something on this. I don't know how many times we're going to have to post something on this. But every time that little kid lets go of that helium balloon and starts crying.
Radar is simply another form of radio transmission. Radio includes anything within the range of the electromagnetic spectrum. Electromagnetic spectrum, also known as light. Radio is the transmission of light, whether it's visible light or radio waves which are not visible. When it comes to radio transmissions, there must be a transmitter and a receiver. There can be a reflector or a transmittal unit along the way. However, in the end, there's got to be at least transmitter and a receiver. And in the case of radar, radar transmits a signal and it bounces off a reflector, and then it comes back to the receiving station. Or it can go to other stations if they're set up in the network properly. Long story short, radar emits a signal, it bounces off something, and then it returns to a receiving unit, and the receiving unit maps that reflection accordingly. If there is no reflector, then there's no return signal, and then the object does not show up on the radar. For example, it's off the screen. Notice, there's no curving around anything. It goes out in a straight line. Radio signals always travel in a straight line. So the transmitter sends the signal out to the target, bounces off, and it comes back in a straight line. Radar cannot travel over the curve, and hence, radar is dependent on line of sight, direct beam from the transmission to the target. It reflects and it comes straight back. There is no curving around anything, thus is radar.
Also, radar works in straight lines. The radar is incapable of curving around a curve, picking up and bouncing back the reflection of what it's picking up. So if you can imagine a ship on the other side of the curve, we'll say 30 miles, 40 miles out, it sends out the radar beam. The radar beam is supposedly curving around this ball, bouncing back, and then bouncing the reflection, curving back around to be picked up by the radar. That's not happening. It's flying out straight, and when it picks up something, it hits it back. It's not going around any curve. That's plain and simple. That can be looked up on your YouTube and see how radar waves work. They don't go around the curve. Every diagram shown will show you straight lines. They don't show you curved lines.
As we zoom out to look at the larger scope of things, once we verify that, we're able to zoom out over a large distance. Now, over this screen, at the time, I was like 18 or 19 years old, all right, when I was doing this job. I wasn't thinking about flat earth and any of this other shit. I was still indoctrinated and under the assumption that the earth is a spinning ball. I never thought about flat earth or anything like that, but I always thought it was weird that as I'm looking at this massive radar screen, I always used to think,